And good evening, Audubon people, Audubonians. I admire your work. You're in a very fascinating and worthy endeavor, I feel. Anything associated with birds is a wonderful pursuit. Thank you. Can I be heard? Do I need a gavel?
Depends if they
Must behave.
If you see anybody sleeping, doesn't it?
Okay.
Oh, why did you take all the birds in the garden and you put it up there?
No, I just want to get oriented here. Ah, yes. Okay. Forward, backward. Yes. So we are going into the arts and crafts garden tonight. And just a word about my background. Yes, I trained as a classical pianist and I played in the States and Europe and China and the UK. But I always had a hunger to learn other things. So I went back to school and I pursued history, literature, Shakespeare, all the things I loved. And I came out with an art history degree and also cultivated my own writing and art. And I gave piano recitals about music and its association with art and literature. All this by way of saying that I am deeply entrenched in the arts, in the visual arts, and that shapes my view of the garden. My husband and I have been longtime members of the UK National Trust. Anybody else familiar with the organization? That's a wonderful, of course, Angela. They have glorious holdings of all this fantastic architecture, houses, manor houses, castles, landscapes, gardens. And there's an American branch of the organization called the Royal Oak Foundation. They give programs and tours and lectures and so forth. So if you're ever in England, you must definitely look up the National Trust. It's an absolutely amazing trust. We first have to make the distinction in the arts and crafts garden between the British arts and crafts garden and the American arts and crafts style. The American came about 20 years later, and we associate the American arts and crafts with Gustav Stickley furniture, no doubt you're familiar with, or the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. But there are two things in common with the American and the British strains of the movement. And that is the idea of making the house coordinate with the landscape, integrating house and landscape. So if you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's house, for example, the Prairie House, it's low slung, it has a flat roof. It really reflects the prairie on which it's sited. Of course, there is a prairie house in Buffalo, and I do not think there are any prairies in Buffalo. So that doesn't work. But the idea of integrating your house with your garden is a fundamental concept to both the US and the British arts and crafts movements. Another fundamental concept is the use of native plants. That's very important, indigenous plants. So here we have William Morris on my mantle, 1834 to 1896. He was trained as an architect, a poet. He's a writer, social activist, and he was founder of the design firm Morris and Company that produced wallpaper and textiles. And for example, blackthorn is one of his designs. It's a popular hedge shrub in England. It produces white flowers and black berries called sloes that create sloe gin, S-L-O-E. And you'll notice the beautiful tapestry-like design of this. We have these tendrils and you have leaves all intertwined. And whenever I use a William Morris fabric or wallpaper in my house, and I'm using a lot of it, I like to take whatever flowers are in it and install them in my garden, if the garden manages to function properly in America with these English hedge things. So here we have, for example, William Morris's golden lily wallpaper. And so, of course, I had to put golden lilies in my garden. Again, integrating the house with the garden. Here we have the red house. So William Morris decried the Victorian way of life. It was the time of the Industrial Revolution. Factories were springing up all over the land, creating blots on the landscape. They were belching smoke. They were dehumanizing people. People weren't even known as individuals who worked in these factories. They were hands. And even the child labor was just very distressing. It was a dreadful time for people's lives. There was no dignity. You can find a good moving account of this in Dickens' novel, Hard Times. And you also have the railroad coming in, of course, at this time. The tracks were being laid down all over the land, and the trains were belching smoke and screeching, and it was just terrible. It was a savaging of the landscape. So Morris looked at this, and he was deeply distressed by it. Understandably, England was so beautiful and pastoral. So he looked back to merry old England. He looked back to an earlier, simpler time, to the England of the Middle Ages. That's why I'm wearing a medieval gown, for those of you who are interested. So he built this red house, and the red house is constructed along the lines of a medieval manor house. It was the first arts and crafts garden. It's not existent today, but it is being recreated as we speak. And you'll notice the architecture of the red house. It is based, again, on a medieval manor house. You have, let's see here. Well, that laser doesn't seem to want to function. Is it there? You see in the center, there's a tower, small tower. We have an L-shaped format, which really surrounds or engulfs the garden. You have windows tucked under the eaves. Now, the typical Morris house was very much in the manner of this medieval style. And the movement flourished in the Red House. He created a whole world of the Middle Ages in the Red House. He had friends there who were painters, architects, craftspeople who did enamelware, embroidery, furniture making, and metalwork. Some of them lived in the Red House. Women wore medieval gowns. And his circle also included the group of painters known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the PRB. Pre-Raphaelite meaning they painted in the style before Raphael, who was in the Renaissance. So before the Renaissance, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And many of you may know the beautiful painting of Ophelia by Sir John Everett Millais. He was one of the major Pre-Raphaelite painters. And this group of painters idealized the past, and they painted these beautiful paintings of legend and past times. So we have exquisite renditions of these plants and flowers with stunning clarity and botanical accuracy, just absolutely beautiful. And notice the tapestry-like effects. Ophelia's gown doesn't even look like it's painted with brush strokes. It actually looks like it's sewn, like it's embroidered with silk thread. And if you look at the algae in the river, it looks like velvet. In fact, the whole painting looks like a tapestry, like a very rich embroidered or stitched piece of art, like velvet. And this is very much in accordance with the crafted needlework that was done by the people in the Red House. Well, the gardens of the Middle Ages had vanished, so William Morris wanted to create one in the Victorian era, but how was he to know what they looked like? Well, he consulted various sources. One of those sources was architecture. He looked back to architecture of the Middle Ages, and the notion of the integrated house and garden was very critical in that house design. So this is Cateel in Cornwall, one of the National Trust properties. And your typical medieval manor house, it's decidedly not a center hall colonial. There's no central staircase or hallway with rooms on either side. The manor house would have at its core a massive room known as the Great Room or the Great Hall. And there'd be a huge fireplace for heat and cooking. People would eat, sleep, socialize, and swill their tankards of mead, have a good time in the Great Hall. They might sleep on pallets of straw on the floor. There might be rushes on the floor to absorb odors. And the Great Hall would also be occupied by livestock, such as pigs. So a typical medieval manor house had a courtyard. And note how the building, like the Red House, which followed it, engulfs the garden area in this courtyard L-shaped footprint. And you have a small tower, something like a tower in the center. Again, similar to the Red House, you have an archway through the building, which lets horses and nature trot right through, and walls smothered in greenery. This is very much part of the look for the arts and crafts garden. Here's another house. This is Baddesley Clinton, okay? And notice the three pointed gables up here and how they reflect the diamond pattern on the lawn below. And this again is to show the integration between the house, between the structure and the garden. Now, I do live in an arts and crafts house, as Angela said, although I'm along much more modest lines, I should add, in a simpler style that's rather like an American interpretation. There's a central room, but I don't have pigs in there, unlike the medievals. And I do have a courtyard, which has a couple of walls from the house, creating an L formation and two other walls around it. And here is the courtyard in the summer with the hydrangeas. So my house is something like the poor man's arts and crafts garden of Britain. So here we have medieval architecture that inspired Morris. And it also included castles. It included cathedrals and monasteries. This is Bodiam Castle, a medieval castle, a plump moated castle with this round tower. And that brings me to Sissinghurst. This is one of the greatest gardens in England. It was designed by Vita Sackville-West, garden designer and writer, and her husband. And when they bought Sissinghurst Castle, it really was nothing but ruins and remnants, but they were quite determined to turn it into something marvelous. And they created this extraordinary garden. It's almost like the blueprint or floor plan of a castle. You could think of this round room here as almost like that tower we just saw at Bodiam Castle, like the floor plan of the tower. You have these clipped yew hedges that act as corridors, again, creating a kind of architecture outside. And you have in the back walls, a wall here, green walls that lead to a canal. And also we have many boxwood gardens here, creating, again, outdoor rooms, integrating the indoors with the outdoor. You might look at this central space here and wonder, well, why create just an empty space? Why leave it empty? Why not put in flowers, have something to look at? Well, it's actually quite magical because you go in and you're confronted with four possibilities. Which way do you turn? And so it almost compels you to move. You have to move to something that feels like more of a destination. So blank space has its definite qualities. Now, we also have the idea of the union of the house and garden in kind of extending the geometry of the house into the outdoors. This is Kelmscott Manor. This is another William Morris house, and you'll notice the alley in front, okay? The straight line extending the geometry of the house, and this has these rose standards on either side. So naturally, having seen alleys in England, I had to put an alley on my property. So here I have a little plum tree alley. And in winter, you can see the checkerboard floor as well as at other times of year because the snow melts on the ground, but not on the pavers. And I have checkerboard patterns in my house. So again, this idea of creating a sympathy between the structure and the outside world. This is a pergola at Hidcote, another of the great gardens of England. And Hidcote is chock full of flowers. And this is a wonderful rustic arbor. And pergolas and arbors are another way to extend architectural elements into the garden and make house and garden cohesive. I have a pergola on my property, and it has clematis and wisteria. And in front, there is a boxwood parterre with two diamonds and a central element. And the pergola is built in such a way you walk through and you can, oops, what happened there? There. You walk through and you can look through windows in effect and see different parts of the garden. Here you can look through and see the birdhouse. And here's the pergola from the outside. Again, a structure outside to unify house and garden. I also have a honeysuckle arbor. And walls are another way to extend the architecture of the house into the garden. This is the wondrous Snows Hill Manor garden in England. It's a 16th century Cotswold Manor house. And beyond this wall is a magical garden. And the wall itself it's aged with lichen, it's abraded, it's weathered, and it's a wonderful backdrop or a canvas for climbing vines, roses, espalier, and perennials. Now, for those of you who are lucky enough to have castle ruins on your property, you might want to do something as we see here at Sudeley Castle. Note the tower and the windows. There's the tower and the windows that probably had stained glass, and the stone tracery. You have in the center a great fireplace and a stone bench. This gives you idea of what the Great Hall would have looked like, only now in its quite dilapidated state. The walls are smothered with roses. And again, the fusion of building with nature. And whoever decided to put these yellow roses on this yellow wall was absolutely brilliant. It's just
Pretty.
lovely.
Okay,
I have stone walls on my property. Walls also are architectural. And this stone circle, for example, is now billowing with various plants. It's filled in quite well. I have a steep hill in the back, and I put in a low stone wall in front here, kind of contoured or scalloped to conform to the contours of the hill. So it's not quite straight, it's sort of rounded. And the front of the wall is now filled in with cotoneaster. So doors are another architectural element to put in the landscape. Here again is my courtyard door, and it's very weathered, as you see. So as you might imagine, anything that is weathered would be very desirable in the arts and crafts movement because it's old. So I had a carpenter look at this, and he said, you know, let me rebuild the wall, the door. I'll make you another door, a nice new door. And I was horrified because no, this gray silver weathered door is beautiful. Anything with age, certainly in England, is prized. So I did not want that door removed, and it was not. We also have a red door, which chimes with our front door, which is red. And I put in a fernery with dawn redwoods, and they have lovely peeling brown bark and fluted kind of buttressed trunks. And the leaf structure is not unlike that of a fern or frond. Outbuildings such as potting sheds and barns create a kind of ensemble. This is John Tradiskant, gardener to Charles II. You'll notice his Peter Pan collar and the buttoned vest and the cloak. And some of you might have Tradescantia or spiderwort in your garden, those of you who are gardeners. On my property, we have a produce house, which produces supposedly sometimes various vegetables and fruits and berries. This is the interior. And it's wrapped in chicken wire, which keeps out every creature from land, sea, or air, hopefully. And this is, chicken wire is ugly, so I have concealed it to the best of my ability right here with Caryopteris and plant matter. And you can see a little bee busy at work here. He apparently likes it very much. Now here's the topiary at Avebury Manor, which is a kind of Stonehenge, a lesser known Stonehenge. I love this topiary because it looks like bottles or it looks like the beef eaters that you see at the Tower of London and the tall fuzzy hats. And trees, whether dead or alive, they can act as a kind of structure or armature for other plants. And here again in England, we have these gorgeous climbing roses clambering up this old tree. Here's the garden at Hidcote again, and you'll see how architectural it is. There's a central path flanked by two herbaceous borders, and the evergreens, these tall evergreens, function as kind of pillars or columns, almost like a building. And in the back, we have this tall green wall. And this is another way to illustrate how plants can be structural. This wisteria has no arbor or built support, but it has been trained to be freestanding and to create an arch that frames the bench. Now, question, how do we know we're in England in this picture? Anyone? Umbrella. Right. Here we have Sissinghurst again, and the notion of plants clambering all over the building. Below it is a cottage garden. And my American answer to plants clambering all over the building is my smokehouse, which you see on the left here. It extends underground. It has a moss roof, and it is engulfed in plant life. And so this is kind of the American look of the arts and crafts garden. You see the pergola here, covered in plants, plants draped over everything. It's kind of a wild, overgrown look. Here I have some wisteria outside the kitchen. And here we have, again at Hidcote, this wonderful house of greenery. It's amazing. It's life-size, quite large. And you'll notice the staircase here. It's a rounded staircase. It's by the garden designer, Edward Lutyens. And the circular profile is actually reflected in the circle of the path adjacent to it. So staircases, those are another element that you can put outside. But there is no staircase like the marvelous one at Hestercombe. This has to be one of the most marvelous staircases there is. It's also by Lutyens. And actually, I have to credit the photo to Robert Freitas of the Victorian Web, which is quite an extensive Victorian resource. I wrote some essays on it myself. They cover every topic. This staircase is grand and theatrical. It's almost like a stage set, except you don't need any actors because the staircase provides the drama. Look at this gnarled tree here. And the pergola with these big stone columns and all of the plants, the greenery in the staircase, in the wall. It's an absolute beautiful staircase. On a much lesser level is my staircase on my property. It is meant to be integrated with the general landscape, so natural materials and so forth. And this leads to what I call base camp that then goes to trails in the hills. It's in the foothills of the Appalachians. So medieval tapestries, that's another source that William Morris was familiar with and consulted in his refiguration of the medieval garden. So I have various tapestries in my house as wall hangings and pillows and covers and so forth, placemats. And I was looking at this tapestry and I noticed up here in the right-hand corner, this is a house that's not unlike Morris's red house. You see the tower in the middle, the L-shaped configuration. There's actually a well over here. Okay. And this tapestry depicts what looks like a cherry tree over here. And people are breaking bread and they're drinking wine. And you see the dog at the bottom. He's looking at this bottle of wine in the water with great annoyance. He wants it. But I wanted to bring your attention here to the flowers. Medieval tapestries are spangled with flowers. It's known as mille fleurs, or 1,000 flowers. And flowers demonstrated the skill of the weaver. The more flowers, the costlier the tapestry. But these flowers were not just a way to sell tapestries. Medieval lawns actually looked like this with lovely flowers all over. It was known as the jeweled lawn. And they also had the flowery mead, MEAD, like our modern word meadow. Here's William Morris's orchard fabric, and you see here the tufts of flowers, very much inspired by the Middle Age tapestries. So like many people, I have been trying to install a meadow on my property for the birds and the creatures. So I cast seeds every year. Some things never make their appearance, others do, and some I physically plant in tufts by hand. So this is cranespill, and here's bee balm. And then creeping thyme, when it's in bloom in the spring, it crawls all over, and it definitely looks like that medieval jeweled lawn. Here's another tapestry, and this demonstrates another component of the medieval garden, which is that of the fruit tree. The medieval garden was a productive garden. They had fruits, they had berries and vegetables, and the red house was actually set in an orchard. So I had to have fruit trees. So I put dwarf fruit trees on my hill. And even if they never bear fruit, for the flowers alone, they earn their keep. It's a flood of white flowers, pink flowers in the spring. It's just glorious. And look at these plump, dark pink buds on this peach tree and the silvery gray, scaly bark. It's so full of character. I also have plums and more peaches here. Lots of berries, blackberries and so forth, blueberries, and pears. So I'm trying to do everything in my garden that I can to make it an authentic middle-aged garden. So Morris and his circle also studied stained glass. And the stained glass windows they would see on monasteries and cathedrals and manor houses. Tiffany was of this era. And here we have Badgley Clinton again, and you can see the stained glass. And here is another painting by one of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is Mariana by Millet, and that's from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. And you'll note the stained glass and the rich reds and that rich royal blue color. And she is embroidering from nature. She's embroidering from nature. You can see these leaves scattered on the floor. That would be very William Morris, embroidering from nature. And I know gardeners lament that they can't get a good blue on their property, and even bluebells are really purple. It's hard to get a good cobalt blue. But if you turn to berries, like these viburnum berries, you have cobalt blue. You get beautiful, big swatches of blue on your property with these viburnums. And you can also get a glorious vivid red with viburnum berries as well. So do not rule out berries if you want color in your garden. Illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages also furnished Morris with visual information for his conception of the arts and crafts garden. So here we have an example of the walled garden. The walls serve to protect plants against the wind. They protect people against marauders and wild animals. And in this depiction, you can see a trellis, you can see fruit trees and climbing vines. And the enclosed garden in the medieval era was known as the hortus conclusus, which is a private space for reflection and spiritual nourishment. And very often, the hortus conclusus would be a rose bower. The great garden designer Gertrude Jekyll of the Victorian era loved walls in her creations, and the walls could be of hedges, it could be of masonry, it could be a fence, it could be the side of a building. She divided her rooms, her garden rooms, according to color or flower type or even season, such as the snowdrop room. I also love garden rooms, and I like to have my areas color themed. So I started this yellow bank. I wanted warm colors, so everything in this area is red, yellow, chartreuse, and then evolved into this. I also have some native grass equisetum here, horsetail. which will trot over everything in its path. So you must confine it to a pot or put it where it won't go trotting around the yard. It earns its name, horse. And I like to segregate my colors. And so here I have a purple area with little blue stem and asters. Here we have Sleeping Beauty of the Briar Rose series. This is by Edward Burne Jones. And this expresses a more elusive quality of the arts and crafts garden. And that is the idea of the enchanted garden. There are 5 native roses in England, and they're called briar roses. And here again, we have this idea of being intertwined with nature. But this is the interior of the castle. You can see the windows. But the plants have even infiltrated the interior. They're climbing all over everything. And this is Sleeping Beauty, of course, under an enchantment and under a spell. And here we have another enchanted garden by a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Waterhouse. This is his enchanted garden. All the paintings I'm showing you are of the PRB. And here you see some of the elements that the arts and crafts group were greatly enamored of. This is the cloister of a monastery. Again, we have this notion of enclosure. This is the ambulatory and the covered walk. We have climbing vines adorning the structure. The women are in medieval clothing. Scent is also important in the style, as we see here. And sound was also part of this garden concept, the sound of splashing water with a fountain or some kind of water feature. So my adaptation, little fountain. And don't rule out a bird bath as a water feature because it does make sound when the rain is plucking it or the birds are splashing around. And here's another bird bath, which also has the reflective quality of capturing the sky when you look into it. So it creates another interesting surface. And this is a crabapple tree in the spring. But I must say, I was wrestling with the idea of the enchanted garden and how to achieve enchantment. And then I decided that very large flower heads would contribute. So I planted these globe allium, and they're gigantic, and they have the look of a fairy tale or a fantasy. Rhododendrons also have supersized flowers, and they can be profuse with blooms, creating an almost magical, enchanted look. And there are native rhododendron, the Catawba rhododendron. And I also find that very loose, feathery, wispy flowers add to an air of enchantment, creating a kind of misty dreamscape. And this is an area of my garden with a stone table that's engraved with the date of the house, 1879. Tight and sharply delineated flowers, such as marigolds, might not work. I also found myself cogitating on the idea of enchantment when I was walking through the woods, and lo and behold, what did I come upon but a talking tree? And here we see his eyes, his mouth, and he's dribbling acorns. He's very jowly, as you see. He has these knobby ears, and his hair is moss. And talking trees always crop up in fairy tales. I also encountered a talking turtle. He's quite large, and here you see his eye, his pointed nose, and his mouth. Now, going up our driveway, we have these gigantic boulders, much taller than a person, and among them, we have Grumble Rock. Here's Grumble Rock. You see his downturned mouth, and I've never seen him be anything but disgruntled and grumpy. Here he is chomping on red leaves. He has an ugly disposition, but we love him all the same. So look at your property, look at your trees, look at your rocks, look at everything, and you might see faces in there, and they might be enchanted. Other stylistic elements, we have Thomas Hardy's cottage in England, and what greater way to unify house and landscape than with a thatched roof. What could be more natural and beautiful? This is a cottage garden, And that notion was taken up by the arts and crafts group, such as Vita Sackville West. It was all about an abundance of flowers with no ground visible, no bare dirt, no mulch. And this was a radically different concept from the gardening practices of the time. There were other Victorians who liked beds of brightly colored annuals with bare dirt and mulch, everything geometrically arranged with a great deal of clarity. Those Victorians outside of the arts and crafts group, many of them were plant hunters, and they would travel the world and bring back exotic plants, some of which had to be kept in greenhouses or hothouses. But the idea of the arts and crafts group was all about natives. Now, I don't know if Morris's group knew anything in terms of the environmental benefits of native plants, but they took their cues from history. The people of the Middle Ages did not travel much. They would take their occasional pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but basically travel was very difficult. So they stayed home and they had very insular lives and very local areas that they stayed in. As a result, the plants in the landscape really consisted of whatever grew naturally in their region. So you didn't see exotics, you saw natives. So I have installed many natives on my property. And I must say, Ms. Angela, you have been a great teacher in that department. You have been so inspirational in terms of natives, and I know how important they are. So I have 9 bark, number of different varieties. And this is the petite plum. It turns purple later in the season and reaches its zenith with this brilliant red color. There's also chartreuse, 9 bark. I also started a redbud collection. This is the vanilla twist redbud. They get pink flowers. Some of them get white in the spring. And I have lots of native viburnums such as brandywine, nannyberry, and possumhaw. Also, the major wheeler honeysuckle. This is a red honeysuckle. It's deer resistant. The hummingbirds in particular, love it. This is my statue of an English gardener from the 1700s. It's a copy of one in Yorkshire. I was sold on the statue because of the buttoned breeches with the bow and the wrinkled stockings and the buckled shoes. But actually, you tend not to see statues in the arts and crafts garden, certainly not classical statues of Greek gods like Venus or Apollo with these idealized faces and bodies, or Renaissance statues like the David. Statues and stone carvings of the Middle Ages were very different. You had these ugly gargoyles and gremlins crawling over cathedrals, and figures were flawed and twisted and full of character. So in that spirit, I installed the 7 deadly sins in my smokehouse. And here we have this wrinkled, indolent face of sloth, as the British pronounce it. So we talked about integrating the house with the garden. You also want to integrate the garden with the larger landscape and what is beyond. I have stone outcroppings on my land, so I put a stone bench to keep the look consistent. Seating also serves to bring people into the larger landscape. And I know people who have woods on their property, but they never go in them because they think of the woods as just a buffer against the neighbors. But if you do have a forest or field, it's a great idea to establish trails through them and walk there with the dogs or take your constitutional. England is webbed with these wonderful public footpaths, and you can follow them through beautiful farmland and fells. This is a path in the Lake District in Beatrix Potter Country. We put signs in our mountain and trails to encourage people to walk through them, and created a map. If this were nothing but grass here, no one would really go by these viburnums, but because it's a path, it leads you through. This is the Lake District again in the north of England. And I know whenever I see a path, I want to follow it. And if it looks long and steep and I can't see around the corner, that's even better. And you see in England, all these ancient walls ribbing the landscape. It's just glorious. Here's a mossy path through my woods. And here you have another portion of my woods. Nature is such a wonderful artist. You have the pale spring green color, and then moss spilling over this rock and this lichen on the rocks and on the tree as well. It's just a beautiful composition. They say nature doesn't get her colors wrong, and I think there's some truth in that. England is laced with stone walls and the local stone wall is often used to build the houses, again, creating a kind of harmony between the settlement and the surrounding region. It's so natural looking. There are stone walls in my woods, and I imagine some of you have stone walls on your property as well. And again, a worker on my property, he saw the stone wall, so he wanted to take these stones to repair a new wall. And I insisted that he could not do that because these stone walls are history and they have to be preserved and they tell a story. This was once farmland or grazing land. So stone walls are historical documents and we should keep them wherever possible. Leave them intact. Bridges are another way to encourage people to walk through your land. And this is a charming old packhorse bridge, Slater's Bridge in England. Look at that construction. So we get a vernal pond in our forest that washes out. So we have a bridge that enables us to use the paths year round because they do get washed out in the spring. And I know a person anyway, who put river rocks down to suggest a dry riverbed on her property. And she put a bridge over it and it was charming. So even if you don't have a river or a stream, you can put a bridge and river rocks underneath and it's charming. This is Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, a magnificent and extensive pile. The Victorians loved ruins. Turner painted them and Wordsworth wrote poetry about them. And ruins evoke the past. And they compel your thoughts to be in two places at once. You have to think of the building in all of its former glory, but then you see it today in its sadly dilapidated state. I actually have an essay online about ruins on a British publication. So if you're interested in that, you might pursue. Do I have a ruined abbey on my property though? Did I go that far? Some English people actually do. They build the ruins of an abbey on their property to indicate that it was historical. No, I don't have an abbey, but I do have my humble stone edifice here with the window and the door. And it's quite grown in now, and I filled in a lot of ferns and so forth, evergreens. This is Rhus aromatica, which turns red. It's low-growth sumac, turns red in the fall. There's a little millstone here. I want to suggest a settlement. And ruins are a nice place to go and sit and contemplate and just kind of escape the busy world. And here's another scene of the ruins. And lastly, we come to Bruegel's Spring. This is not a pre-Raphaelite painting, of course. This is much earlier from the Middle Ages. This expresses fundamental concepts of the movement. Here is an arbor or pergola, okay? And you also have these raised beds. Raised beds were common in the monastery gardens of the Middle Ages. Different monks would be responsible for different plants. The infirmary would tend the physic garden with medicinal herbs. So he would have his own set of flats for that. There were other monks with specific tasks devoted to these flats. For example, the monk associated with the kitchen would be responsible for the culinary herbs, and he would preside over his flats, and so on. But the fundamental philosophy of the arts and crafts movement is really expressed in this painting. Notice that the people are smiling. Over here, you have a man helping an old woman, and she's leaning on him. In this corner, people are dancing. These men over here are working together. These women are shearing sheep, and they're probably gossiping and gabbing and having a good old time of it. People are planting flowers. This painting depicts community. It depicts joy and the idea of gratification in work. And that was so vastly different from the life of the poor factory hands in the Victorian era who labored in punishing working conditions. Some of them children who worked 10, 12 hours a day. There's a moral underpinning here and in the arts and crafts movement. I said earlier that William Morris was a social activist. He said he did not want anything in his house that was created by someone who suffered in the making of it, such as a factory worker. And that's part of the reason Morris looked back to the Middle Ages. There were people who practiced their trades in small villages then, the tradespeople, and these were millers, blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, thatchers, plasterers, weavers. They belonged to guilds, and the guilds guaranteed prices and protected their rights. The tradesperson actually had a standing in the community. He was respected for his skill. So unlike those nameless, faceless hands in the factories, he took pride in his work. So William Morris's conception of the arts and crafts movement was not just about visual beauty. It was about something deeper. It was about the beauty of the soul, about human dignity, and about filling hearts with joy. Thank you.